Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Psychedelics Today, a weekly podcast exploring the science and culture of the emerging psychedelic field with your hosts, Kyle Buller and Joe Moore. If this is your first time tuning in, welcome to the show. Happy to have you here. So today on the show, we are joined by Erik Davis. Erik is an American journalist, critic, podcaster, counterpublic intellectual whose writings have run the gamut from rock criticism to cultural analysis to creative explorations of esoteric mysticism. He is the author of TechGnosis, Myth, Magic, and Mysticism in the Age of Information, The Visionary State, A Journey Through California's Spiritual Landscape, and Nomad Codes, Adventures in Modern Esoterica, and also the book High Weirdness, Drugs, Esoterica, and Visionary Experience in the 70s. And this is the book that we end up chatting about on the show. So a little bit about the book. It goes through the work of Philip K. Dick, Terence McKenna, and Robert Anton Wilson, and kind of capturing some of the new age spirituality, psychedelic spirituality that rose out of American counterculture in the 60s. And, you know, the work and impact that these three authors had, and also some of the weirdness that kind of came out of this era as well, and in the psychedelic world. Like, some of the stuff that we get into is around Terence and Dennis's story of La Chorrera, and just how weird that experience got. If you've ever listened to Dennis talk about that experience, really interesting him to reflect on it. He really covers that story in The Brotherhood of the Screaming Abyss. So if you don't know too much about that, you should definitely check out Dennis's story there, recounting the event that happened down at La Chorrera, but also kind of the madness that came out of that too. And in this podcast, we kind of talk about that, as well as kind of walking the tightrope here between madness and kind of mysticism. Really interesting topic, right? The balance between a possible spiritual emergence or budding psychosis. You know, it's a tightrope, as Erik would say, and very fine balance. So yeah, we get into a lot of weird things in this episode. I hope you enjoy it. I think it is really important to highlight some of these cultural events and aspects of psychedelia, and a lot of really great things to learn here as well. I think incorporating some of the weirdness into this is really important, or just highlighting the weirdness that transpersonal and psychedelics can like provoke. You know, sometimes we don't always talk about it. We talk about mostly kind of the clinical applications of psychedelics here at Psychedelics Today, but also really acknowledging how weird things get. and that's really important, you know, especially if you are in the clinical field, kind of to brace yourself for possibly some of the weird, quote unquote, weird. I kind of like the word weird. I know sometimes it has a negative connotation when you think, oh, that's just a weird thing. But to me, I don't know, the word, whenever I use it, I'm like, oh, that was really weird. And I think of it as like, I don't really know how to describe it. It was kind of has this mystery to it. It was strange. It was intriguing, kind of weird. That's how I approach it. But I know sometimes people, when you label an event as weird, might come off as negative. But for me, a lot of interesting, weird events happen. And I think they are worth exploring, especially in the transpersonal world. When you kind of start getting in there, and in the psychedelic realm, things tend to get a little odd. So yeah, I hope you enjoy this episode with Erik Davis. Really excited to have him on here finally. It's been a long time coming. And yeah, if you haven't checked out his book, check it out. High Weirdness. You can actually grab your book on Audible if you're an audio person. That's where I grab the book and listen to it. So check that out. If you're starting to become more of an audio person like me, go grab a copy of that Audible. And I think that's it for that intro. If you like what we're doing here at Psychedelics Today, be sure to subscribe to us on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, Google Podcast, wherever you listen. Feel called, leave a review on Facebook or iTunes. Helps us out a whole bunch, so thank you. If you want to support us on Patreon, patreon.com/psychedelics today. And I think that's about it. If you are interested in our upcoming course, Navigating Psychedelics for Clinicians and Therapists, so if you're a therapist or clinician, a coach, if you work one-on-one with somebody and really are trying to understand the psychedelic framework and have a good foundation for understanding psychedelics, join us at the Navigating Psychedelics for Clinicians and Therapists course. And our new group starts Thursday, July 9th. We have 2 groups. One starts at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, and the other one starts at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. To learn more, you can head on over to psychedeliceducationcenter.com and find the class for Navigating Psychedelics for Clinicians and Therapists, and you can learn more there. So check that out. That's coming up again Thursday, July 9th. We're kicking off 2 new groups, and that's psychedeliceducationcenter.com. So that's it for now. I hope everybody is having a wonderful week, staying safe, staying healthy, and taking care of yourself. Really important during these times. So hope everybody enjoys this episode, and we will catch you on the other side.
This episode is brought to you by Mudwater. Mudwater is a coffee alternative with 4 medicinal mushrooms and adaptogens. With 1/7 the caffeine is a cup of coffee, you get sustainable energy without the anxiety and jitters of coffee. Kyle and I have had about 3 months worth of Mudwater, and we really like it a lot. Mudwater has really helped me slow down my coffee consumption, and I feel great after drinking it. Another thing I like about this company is that they donate a portion of each month's revenue to MAPS. Check them out at mudwater.com, mudwtr.com. Use the code psychedelic at checkout for 15% off. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Psychedelics Today. Today we have on the show Erik Davis, author of High Weirdness, Drugs, Esoterica, and Visionary Experience in the 70s. And he's also the co-founder of Psychedelic Sangha. Thanks for joining us, Erik.
Sure. Happy to be here.
I had a really fun time reading your book, or listening to the audiobook more specifically. And yeah, I was just really struck by how impressive it was. I kind of knew it was going to be impressive. I've been aware of your work for a long time, and just super excited that you covered Terence McKenna, Robert Anton Wilson, and Philip K. Dick in one book. You're like, why did it take till now for somebody to do that? So thank you for doing it.
Yeah, it was a lot of work, but it was pretty satisfying. It came out, better than I hoped. So I'm pretty happy with it.
Yeah, it was really a really fun read and really helpful for unpacking a lot of this stuff. I think I knew most of the trivia, but your analysis was super helpful. Like, for instance, unpacking the quote unquote experiment at La Chorrera was, very helpful, because that was a really weird scene. And I haven't read Brotherhood of the Screaming Abyss yet, but I've listened to plenty of Terence and Dennis talk about it in lectures and whatnot. And it's just been a really weird thing to get my head around. And you really helped with that. Like, maybe before we get into that particular story, like what was your background that made you want to cover this, or these 3 individuals?
Well, the story of the book, which I told before, is that I went into the PhD program and really just wanting to write about Philip K. Dick. I'd always want to write about his mystical experiences and the exegesis and his late work, and look at him not so much as a fiction writer, but as a guy who happened to write fiction, who had this stuff happen to him, and how did he use fiction to kind of deal with it. And at the very last minute, I was all ready to go, and that was just going to be my dissertation. And I just quavered. I got like a sense of unease. Like, I didn't want to spend 3 years in Philip K. Dick's head. And then I need to pull back. And then as soon as I did that, it just became really clear that one of the things that interested me was when, and to some degree where his experiences happened, California in the early to mid 70s. And that there were these other things I'd always been thinking about that were happening about the same time. And there are actually these similarities between these experiences, elements of science fiction, of mysticism, of countercultural hedonism, kind of absurdity, like humor, lots of synchronicities. And they all kind of pointed to something that seemed to be happening to this larger question of religious experience, which is a really important topic of study in religious studies, which is what my degree is in. It's like, what is religious experience? How can we say that anything is religious? So I kind of noticed that these experiences these 3 guys had, even though they're very different in some ways, were really similar, and that they all kind of pointed to something like after religious experience, or something that has an element of religion but is also not religious. and more paranormal maybe, or more absurd, or more existential, or more cartoony, or all of these other elements. And so I was like, okay, I just want to like try to show, kind of place them all into a context and try to allow them to resonate. So it's less about arguing why this thing is like that and really drawing tight connections, and more about parallel stories that kind of resonate. And then the main sort of line that I took was, as a scholar or someone who's been thinking about this stuff for a long time, which is like, well, I don't want to reduce it, but I don't really believe it. So how the basic line is, I wanted to take these things and experiences seriously without taking them literally. And that is the balance that I think a lot of people really like, is that usually it's one or the other. They're either like, oh my God, they had this vision experience on the other side, the other planet, and the whole alien nuncio and the whole thing. Or it's just like, well, this is just brain chemistry, or it's just history. It's just hippies at a certain time telling their stories to themselves. And there's a good degree of that as well. But, I really wanted to kind of take it to another level and think about it seriously, kind of as if you would think about a philosophical argument, or you think about the meaning of a poem, or, where you really want to take it seriously because it's got a lot of heft to it. So it was a fun interpretive game on one level. And then on another level, I was really trying to kind of model ways of thinking about psychedelic and visionary experience that I just don't see very much of. Like, I wanted to like create a really complex set of ways of approaching it from different angles that just will encourage other people to do more of the same and take it in their own directions, and just add some, I don't want to say sanity, because part of my game is to play with the insane in a certain way, not just to stay sane about it, but to bring a certain kind of pragmatic playfulness, where again, we're really wrestling with the issues, but we're not getting caught up in the usual stories, either the reductive stories or the believing stories. So that was my kind of goal.
Yeah, you did. I think you did an extraordinary job, and it kind of sets the stage for a number of grad students to really dig deeper in interesting ways. And yeah, this Robert Anton Wilson's reality tunnel kind of vision, I think it looks a little bit similar to how you approached it. Like, how do we take this approach and that approach, and maybe we get a more full picture of these characters in history?
Yeah, very much so.
3 probably the most important figures in psychedelic or weird history.
Definitely in terms of like the novelty of their visions, I think, and the way in which their visions were also kind of cultural statements, cultural inventions. I think some people there's probably other figures that are, they're better on the science, or better on the therapeutic side, or even better on the mystical side. I mean, in some ways, none of these guys were really quite mystics either. They weren't like going for the one, quote, yes. They were more interested in the diversity and multidimensionality of it, which has always been kind of more interesting to me also, both as an experiencer and as a reader and thinker about these things. So there's probably, there's other facets of the experience that I think, other figures and texts handle really well. But the weird side of things, these guys definitely take the cake.
Right. So you have a pretty good intro, but then you lead right into Terence and start talking about this experiment at La Chorrera and all the craziness leading up into it. And, it's just a really extraordinary story to begin with. And then your, commentary really helped. Was there anything in particular about the experiment at La Chorrera that made you want to write about that?
Well, I mean, I guess it was, I think it's one of the great stories of, the trip too far, or, the big trip, the world-rending apocalyptic trip, where they didn't quite come away with wearing a signboard that says the end is nigh, but in some other ways, kind of yes. So it's sort of a great, and they also wrote great texts about it. I mean, we have a number of iterations of stories from both fellows. So that's also part of the reason I was interested in these 3 guys, is they were all writers.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just that they had these experiences. I could have also put Lily in the bunch. In fact, for a while, I was going to include Lily, but the project got too big. Mm-hmm. Not just because he had crazy experiences in the early 70s, which he did, but because he wrote about them. And the way that he wrote about them was actually kind of interesting in itself. And I think that's true of all these guys. So it wasn't just they had these experiences that then they wrote about them in a really interesting way that almost kind of communicated something of the experiences to you as a reader. And so it kind of created this weird playfulness between writing and then in Terence's case also speaking and telling stories and the events themselves. So it's just one of the kind of, and then also I wanted to take Terence seriously. I mean, again, he's in a very interesting place because he's extremely influential in one way, and then in a way that was really important to him. He never really was taken that seriously as an intellectual or even a kind of fringe anthropologist or anything like that, even though he had this great idea about the origin of consciousness and human culture. And then he has this time wave idea that's definitely wackier than that, but still something that he really took seriously. And in a way, he never really got that feedback that I think he really wanted from the mainstream, particularly with the Food of the Gods, that while it is still considered a kind of fringe, not quite fringe anymore, but like an outside, it's not that many people believe it. If you go look now, and I just went about a year ago and hunted through the contemporary literature, that there's more and more, real paleo anthropologists and who are taking it seriously, who are like, well, they were taking these drugs and we see this explosion of culture and we need to find a mechanism. I mean, they have to come up with some kind of materialist explanation. And you can say, oh yeah, there was a mutation in the brain that allowed culture to happen. You're like, okay, you can't really point to it. So there's actually more people who are like, yeah, that's a legitimate theory. There's not a lot to support it, but it's a legitimate theory. Whereas when he wrote it, it was completely marginal. Nobody took it seriously, with a few little exceptions. There was always some people who were kind of at least leaning in that direction. So he didn't really get that kind of treatment. And so I kind of wanted to do something sort of in between, which is to actually recognize that just like if you were going to write about a literary figure or an artist or a philosopher, and you talk about their influences, their philosophical influences, what were the ideas they were putting together as a way of understanding what their work is. In a lot of ways, their work was, at least in part, these experiences. Like it was like a creative act, like a theater that they established. And in some ways, it was a theater. Like when you look at the actual ritual space they created for their experiment. First, they called it an experiment, but it's half a ritual and half an experiment, a pseudoscientific or wild science kind of idea that did have scientific ideas in it, but they were mobilized in these kind of alchemical ways. That's already kind of interesting. And then they actually set the stage. They have the I Ching hexagrams written out, and then they have the morpho butterfly, and then they have the big mushroom, and they set it up, and then they do the ritual chant, which is also a kind of sonic signal that's going to produce these wave vibrations. So it's kind of scientific and also clearly ritualistic and evocative. And so it's like already it's like this theater of transformation and novel experience that then they unpack for the rest of their lives to some extent and make other kinds of meaningful statements out of it, give talks, write books, So you can kind of take it as like that, as like a creative act or a philosophical move, and understand it in the same kind of way. Again, avoiding the two traps of reducing it to psychosis or to neurochemistry, or thinking they had really broken into some interdimensional reality and we're only now kind of catching up to their vision. Instead, it's that kind of place in between that they themselves often occupy, that there's a quality of irony or a quality of skepticism, and that was another really important key to me, is that, to take a bigger picture, especially in the counterculture from Aldous Huxley through Ram Dass, through even, the 90s rave scene, is that psychedelic experience and something like religion or spirituality have been really wrapped up with each other. That at a certain point, people started to go, look, it's in the religious texts, like the Tibetan Book of the Dead for Timothy Leary, or Hindu practice for Ram Dass, or even esoteric magic for some fringe psychedelic people. But it's in those kinds of quasi-religious or specific or explicitly esoteric and mystical things that you find the best explanations or frames for psychedelics. That's that's part of the story, but it's not the whole story. And there's another side of psychedelics that supports something that I think is a little harder to put your finger on, which is a kind of secular approach to visionary experience, or a kind of free thinking mysticism that's not like going to wind up on another religious ideology, but is actually trying to, again, like free thought, free thinking. It's a great term. It doesn't just mean thinking whatever you want. Free thinking means questioning religious dogma. The first wave of scientists and parliamentarians and secular Enlightenment thinkers, they were free thinkers. But it's a great term because it reminds us that part of what we're talking about here is cognitive liberty and exploration and invention and the act of philosophy, which is always an invention in a void, that you're using language that other people use, and we're kind of building this rickety structure, and it kind of floats for a while, but you look at it from another angle and you can see all the holes in it, and you're like, okay, we got to build another one. And that's just kind of my attitude. I'm like a real pragmatist. Like, we're building these things as we go along. We're flying on the flying carpet. We got to sew it as we fly on it. We got to bail out the water on the boat that we're going across the sea. It's like we're always kind of inventing and fabricating out of these deeper experiences. And so I wanted to see, let's look at what they did as this kind of invention or fabrication. I mean, in the context of larger mysteries, it's not like they're just making it up, but it's that building quality that I think is really key. And skepticism is part of it. Like, what are we doing? Who knows? Did we really talk to an alien entity? Maybe not. Or maybe it doesn't matter. Or other kinds of questions then become part of the search, rather than, there's the belief and then we're either believing it or we reject it. Instead, it's like the skepticism is part of the search. And Dick was the same way. He asked skeptical questions all the time, even though he constantly, even more than these other guys, really wanted to believe. He really wanted to discover an answer, but he never got it because he was too skeptical or too questioning or too ironic or too crazy in some ways to latch on to any one story. So in a way, I feel like these things mirror our own challenges, even if we're not as wild and woolly as these guys. I think that a lot of us wrestling with psychedelics and visionary experience have our own challenge of how do we put these pieces together. We can approach it clinically in terms of therapy and, dominant psychological language. But then, as you say, you turn that over to the side and suddenly all these holy beams are coming through and you're like, oh my God, what do I do with the religious stuff? But if you try to approach it as a religion and you say, oh, they're giving us these insights into transpersonal reality or the mind of Gaia, and we're part of this larger thing. Okay, that's a construct that works. But from another angle, you look at it and you see all the holes in it, and then it's got delusion in it and all this stuff that's it's not quite what we thought it was. And I think that's where at least the thinking people who are trying to wrestle with this stuff find ourselves, that we're kind of kludging something multidimensional together, and it may never be very satisfying, but that creative insecurity is one of the greatest gifts of these compounds, even though a lot of people they don't want that. They want to either know, or they want it just to be hedonistic, or they want it to be definitely healing. And you're like, well, maybe it doesn't heal all the time. What is healing? I don't know. We heal and heal and heal, and then we die. Am I healing at the moment of death? No, I'm dying. Well, is that part of it, or is this something we're trying to avoid? Well, what if psychedelics gives you something about that? Well, that's not about healing anymore. I mean, healing's cool, but there's something else going on that's more cosmic and difficult in a lot of ways. And so I want to invite that difficulty in and be like, okay, it's troublesome. It's confusing. It's a little demonic sometimes. It's not always love and light, and to bring that complexity in and kind of do that intellectually as well as sort of creatively as an encouragement for people to go into that stuff.
Amazing.
Yeah, that's awesome. Joe and I talk about this all the time, and it's so hard to put these experiences in boxes and say, this is what this is good for. Just you pointing out like, oh, here's a clinical application. But I was talking to one of my teachers, and he was really skeptical of even like, there's probably like minimal case use for clinical psychology and psychedelics, and believes that sometimes it's kind of outside that. And it's just so interesting how we want to put it into boxes, and these experiences really kind of take us outside of there and show us, hey, there's actually nothing there at times. And I think that's really hard to grasp for a lot of folks. And I don't know, I think I do well at sitting with uncertainty, but I'm like curious, like, why do you think people struggle to like maybe sit with that, and that we need to put things in boxes and really like label this and that and say, this is what I believe in?
Yeah, I don't know if I have a particularly insightful answer. My experience is that most people don't like uncertainty, or because it is uncomfortable, they just turn away from it, and that's just kind of the human lot. I mean, it's sort of like the way a lot of people don't ask questions about things, or they're happy to accept the kind of given story in the world they're in, or when they break through that story, they fall towards another story, and people do that. And it's unfortunate, because I don't want to just blame people like that's, oh, people just have that tendency, and you got to be strong to like take on the uncertainty. And I don't even think that's true. Like I never had a choice. It wasn't like I was particularly like brilliant or over question. I was just like always puzzled by reality. Like, what? So when I read Robert Anton Wilson, I'm like, oh yeah, like that. It was like it resonated with who I already was. It wasn't like I had to be convinced from some point of secular conviction or religious conviction away from that kind of thing. And I think a lot of other people. But at the same time, it's also, I partly blame culture and our current consumer culture, or whatever you want to call this crazy world we have of like the wellness capitalist scene or whatever, because people don't like uncertainty. As soon as you start asking questions about anything, there's all of these experts ready to sell you their line and sell it, like literally sell it, or at least get you to believe their channel or their riff or their perspective. So there's all this incoming stuff that makes it harder for people to sit with their own uncertainty, because as soon as they encounter something uncomfortable, there's an answer right there waiting for you from someone who's selling it to you. So I don't just blame people. I also blame the kind of structure. In fact, I tend not to really blame people, because it's hard, it's hard to think about things or question stuff or wonder or be with that uncertainty. But for me, like psychedelics, there was no choice. Like if I was going to do them again, I just have to get better at difficult spaces. And is that my temperament? Is that my wiring? It's really hard to know beyond a certain level. But something really interesting happened when I studied religion. I've always been interested in crazy ideas and wild belief systems and the paranormal and conspiracies and even delusions or whatever. New Age weirdness. I was always like, wow, I didn't really believe it or tend to believe it, but I was just interested in it. And when I went through studying religion, I had this weird kind of shift that happened, which is that I became even more sympathetic with why people seek and why they believe and why they build alternate worlds, or they find themselves in cults, or they find themselves with crazy, like the people who are really seeking, I had more sympathy for. But the people who are selling it, the gurus and the con people and the shtickers and the bureaucrats and the liars and all that, I had much less sympathy for. So I came away from it in this weird, like, I kind of admire aspects of religion more. And then there's other aspects that I have very little patience with anymore as a free thinker, as someone who's not interested in like reifying some kind of authority structure. So then I'm really allergic to a lot of gurus in a way that I used to be like, and I still think the spiritual teachers have a role. It's not like I think they don't have a role, but they do. But my attitude towards them has changed a little bit, because I think that uncertainty is part of the path, and not even a spiritual path, but just the path of those of us who see the value of spirituality and of secular approaches or psychological approaches or even neurological approaches, and that we can't resolve in either direction, and that's part of the gift of that uncertainty.
One of my favorite Terence lines is that part of the message of psychedelics is to become increasingly comfortable with uncertainty. And we kind of covered that a few times already, but it's just generally how do we do that? And it's, I don't know, we're just permanently baffled and realizing that the easy answers aren't good final answers, perhaps.
Mm-hmm.
And
that we still have to make decisions. That's the thing. It's not like, there's a kind of, there's an aspect of not knowing that does provide a certain kind of, not escape, but a certain sort of zone of suspension that allows a little bit less agony in like, is this true? Is it not true? And you're like, we don't know, but you still got to make a decision. Are you going to put your mask on? Or are you not going to put your mask on? Are you going to, what are you going to do? So it's like, there are, and that's even scarier. So it's the fact that reality demands that we make moves, make decisions, make value judgments in the face of not knowing. That's really unnerving, especially for modern people who are, brought up to think, really respect, thinking and understanding things. And we're not very good at dealing with intuition, or especially when you know that your intuition may be wrong. You're like, I'm still going with it, but I don't have a choice. But so that's the kind of place that I think psychedelics really, they also require, because Terence talked a lot about courage, and that's part of what that is this figure of courage. And in the book, in High Weirdness, my kind of main image for that is the tightrope walker, where how do you face profound uncertainty or visionary experience or high weirdness in your life? Like it's erupting. You're like, whoa, am I losing the plot here? It's this attitude of the tightrope walker who steps away from solid ground. Whoa. And then it's like, oh, ground, the only way I stay up is by kind of redistributing my weight all the time. And I've got this balance that I'm maintaining as I go deeper and deeper over the maw of craziness. But how do I keep my balance? Well, there's a certain kind of commitment to maintaining perspective. And again, a balance of yes and no, or it's true, it's false, I'm deluded, I'm visionary, whatever, all that. You got to kind of balance it. And if you keep the balance, you can go pretty far and not fall in. But, we fall a lot anyway. But that's sort of the kind of skill set I'm trying to sort of both model and suggest, which is that there's a kind of way of continuing to be reasonable, asking questions, respecting balance and homeostasis, even as you enter into really difficult situations, which is what I think is happening on a global political media level too. I think we're going into a gnarly psychedelic experience that's not going to stop. We can modulate it, but it's like the weirdness or the not knowing, it just gets more and more. And then we get fake videos, and then we get, like the conspiracy theories don't stop, and every arguments and undermining science, and we have to make global decisions, and the weather's changing, and like all that stuff is happening. There's a lot of pressure on people's mental zones. And while I really appreciate the calls for clinicians and the excitement of clinicians that, oh my God, at a time of tremendous mental health problems and a crisis and a lack of other good drugs, here are some things that really seem to be able to at least deal with certain specific problems and maybe can take on more and more in that guise of healing, of balance, And I'm like, that's cool. But they're also good because they scare the shit out of you and they confuse you. And you have no choice but to rely on your own not knowing, your own heart, your intuition, the people that you can trust sometimes, the spiritual forces that you can trust sometimes, and go forward and be like, okay, this is what it's like to be making decisions in a void. And I think that is just as important in a lot of ways as the specifically kind of healing or integrative or holistic sort of, woven togetherness, integration that people talk about all the time, but on its own is not enough. On its own, it's just wellness industry. It's got to be balanced with something that's hairier. In my view, that's just where I'm at. And that's why these stories are the ones I wanted to tell, because, that's what the weird is. It's like, okay, they're great. They can be holy. They can be integrative. They can be healing. They can be unifying. They can be restoring. All those things are true. And they're totally weird. And what are you going to do with that? You can pretend it's not there, so that your story about psychedelics is your story about, the therapists alone. And you don't want to talk about Terence McKenna anymore. It's too weird. You don't want to talk about Robert Anton Wilson. That's not going to help. But you're like, those are our stories. Those are our ancestors, our being Western psychedelic users who, aren't indigenous. And unless we're working really hard, and I have respect for people who really put a lot into like connecting with indigenous traditions, working with healers as apprentices, as scholars, as anthropologists, as critical thinkers, as well as people who are open and have the heart to be able to engage. And I believe that those communications are possible and they're incredibly valuable, but they're really hard. And most people don't do it. Most of the people who say they're doing it aren't actually doing it. Most of us are kind of a mix and a mess of like the limits of the West, but we're not really in the indigenous. We don't have the connections, and we're trying to figure it out with our friends and popular culture. And how do we kind of do all that? And, for people like us, these guys, and there's, a bunch of ladies that I didn't talk about, but other people are our ancestors, and that we should think about them not as like they had the answers, but that they were part of a lineage that we're a part of, and we can we can learn from that and take even solace from it, even if they're kind of crazy or they kind of lost the plot, because those are the crazy uncles that we have. And that was part of the reason I wanted to write the book too, is like, now as we're changing our story about what psychedelics are, let us not forget about, crazy Uncle Terence and crazy Uncle Robert,
Right. And as you said, the list could have been enormous, the list of people that had very strange stories, but these, I think, were the most iconic. One thing that really I found helpful, and I've actually suggested the book a number of times already for this, we see this often in the psychedelic world where people get very wrapped up in conspiracy because there's more connections perhaps, and it's easier to make those jumps. I got roped in to trying to moderate some stuff on our Facebook group, like some QAnon video came out, and I was like, okay, cool. I think a lot of these points are bullshit. Please cut it out. And they linked to Twitter. I put a post up. I got eviscerated on Twitter. I'm going, I don't get the problem here. And it's, just clearly a bunch of lunatics out there. But I think this frame of weirdness and your kind of read on Wilson is really helpful for what do we do with this? Because yes, there's fact. Like we know MK Ultra. We know that there's a lot of misbehavior in the government. So like how do you, like, after this project, like to speak about, dealing with or confronting these weird stories that could lead us down a really wrong path? Because
no, I think about conspiracy a lot. I don't feel like I have a really robust set of practices sort of to deal with it, because it's a pretty resilient set of perspectives, or the process of it is resilient. And I always got to say right from the get-go that I recognize that conspiracy theory is a concept that is and has been used to obfuscate real questions, and that conspiracies, at least in a political sense or an economic sense, are totally part of reality, and parts of history clearly evidence this. And so there are reasons to distrust or have questions about, et cetera, et cetera. But that only goes to a certain degree. And so that, that's where I feel like I got like Robert Anton Wilson is a real tonic for some of us. Like we get it at a certain point, and in a way it sort of prevents us from going very far down certain reality tunnels, particularly the more extreme they are, the more intense, the larger the claim, the larger the implied conspiracy, the more you're like, yeah, nice story. But there's like, it's almost like you develop an instinct to step back. And it's not so much a rational set of questions, although I do think there are rational ways of thinking about some of these issues, particularly in terms of trust. So you have a lot of the things we're talking about is a lot of the reason conspiracy theory is bigger now than it was before is that there's just been a larger erosion in trust in institutions or institutional forms of knowledge. So you don't trust the media, you don't trust the New York Times, you don't trust your high school physics professor, you don't trust the astronaut, so you have more and more distrust. And at that point, then you can believe anything because, that we believe what we believe, even tacitly or knowingly within certain kind of ambiguous or a certain sense of ambiguity, we still know through trust, through like, okay, I kind of, maybe they weren't getting it entirely right, but when like all these people for centuries have kind of, been working pretty hard at thinking through the consequences of things and throwing all the skepticism at it, whatever, and they come up with an answer. It's probably not the whole picture, but yeah, it's pretty good. Let's just go with that. It's kind of that building the rickety house sort of thing. And one of the things that I don't get with a lot of people who are into conspiracies is I think it's totally apparent that they don't analyze their own desire to believe. They don't reflect on what they get out of believing what they believe. And they really don't ask the question, why in this sort of universe of different authorities that I could believe, that I disbelieve the history of physics, the professors in the schools, the people who do weather satellites, all these I disbelieve them, but I do believe this, somewhat dodgy seeming character who lives in a shack in Wales who's like figured it out, and it's like, well, I don't want to say that the guy who lives in a shack in Wales is like an idiot. Like I'm actually interested in these people. I've listened to these people my whole life. They're part of what make it a rich reality. But that I would shift my trust from all of those historically based institutions to this, like, what have I handed over? So I see a lot of conspiracy theorists just handing over their own sovereign not knowingness, and they gain a false power of knowing. It's the 5G towers. Yes, it's the 5G towers. I know. And that knowing gives you certain things. One, gives you an answer. Now you know, you're not ambiguous. You're not like, oh my God, maybe there's something to do with the 5G. Even if it's not the corona, the 5G towers are pretty screwed. I think I think they're questionable. I'm very unnerved by our move to 5G and the Internet of Things, both for political and biological reasons. But that's another question. Just me, now I know. But even more than now I know is that I have a story that gives me a certain role. That I simultaneously am like a Gnostic knower. I know the truth and the rest of the world doesn't. So it gives me a kind of power. And not just a power like because I don't have to face ambiguity, but power because like I'm an insider. I know the truth. The rest of y'all are deluded. And when I continue to live my life and realize that I'm just this crazy person with a wacky idea whose only compatriots are other people with wacky ideas and everybody else is ignoring it, I feel small. I feel like I have no power, but now I have a story about that too. So I'm an insider. I know the truth. And the reason I'm still marginalized is because it's an evil system that's keeping the truth down. So I've got a nice psychologically and cognitively coherent package that solves a lot of problems, that makes me feel better, especially if I'm a male, because men are much more susceptible to this kind of conviction, the pleasures of this kind of conviction. And at a certain point, I just don't, that whole psychology, I just doesn't work for me. I don't really have respect for it. I don't really understand it anymore. Which doesn't mean I don't know people who are like conspiracy people who I always listen to. I respect what they do. I push back, like I engage too. But the sort of arrogance and the kind of know-it-allness and the snideness is all, to me, signs of a profound insecurity and an unwillingness to mature into the ambiguity and the constructedness of knowledge that we're kind of like, we're all making it up as we go along, even when there's actual truths. That's just a board, like, 2 + 2 = 4, or the speed of, gravity or whatever. That's like a good foundation stone, but then you got to build something off of it, and then things get weirder. And, you don't get that solid science thing ever, really, not in the human world. So in a way, it loops back to the same question about insecurity and not knowing, and how to know even though you don't know, versus the deliciousness of knowing, of being an expert. I know the answer to your problem, of believing your own story. My role in this world is to be a healer and to help people by acting like I know what I actually really don't know, because it seems to help them, and then it makes me feel better. And there's so much of that. And you can make so much money from that. And the whole thing just like runs on that kind of bullshit, whether politics or the wellness industry or religion, and, even like intellectual fads. Like, it's just so much of it. Conspiracy theory, in a way, is just another kind of hyper version of that. And again, anytime I talk about conspiracy, I also have to end in that kind of Wilsonian skepticism that I'm unsure about my own perspective, and that I do recognize that sometimes conspiracy ideas get into me, and then I start to go, that is a little peculiar now, isn't it? Well, it is true that, you can create whole stories. And we know from history that, all sorts of stuff has been invented. I've been reading, actually lately on this score, I've been reading about like early 20th century con men and how elaborate they were. And I don't know if you guys ever saw The Sting. It's like a movie from the early 70s. It's not a very good movie, but it shows one of these things. So basically, you'd have a mark, and then they would just play this guy, and they would, build up whole like false brokerage houses or false racing tracks with like, dozens of extras and people buying and selling. And the whole thing is completely concocted just to fool this one guy. And so then giving up their own money because they think they're just covering another loan that somebody already gave them. And it's like this really complicated game. And it's just remarkable when you think about, a coordinated group of theatrical tricksters can fool people. So it's foolish also to just believe that there's not massive fooling going on, especially because we can see really crude forms of it, from our president or from Fox News or from the liberals too. I'm an equal opportunity skeptic. So it's like, so the conspiracy theory is tough because, in my own experience, the only people who were into it that were worth talking to were people who were already sufficiently philosophically sophisticated or self-reflexive or questioning in a certain way that it was entertaining and fun, like playful. But the ones who are riding their conviction, it's very hermetically sealed, and you're kind of like, sorry, just doesn't work, and it's not helpful. And so I'm very concerned about how people who would otherwise not, get sucked into certain things get sucked into them.
Right. It's a lot cheaper to build a conspiracy theory than to debunk it overall. So like it's, you can just produce these things.
Yeah.
Like Discordians are one example. And that was like a prototype that's been leveraged probably a lot more since then. Kyle, were you going to say something?
Well, I was just going to come back to that idea of trust that you put out there. I mean, especially in a culture where there's like a lack of trust in our institutions, and we're seeing things, or like, people have been abused against institutions or manipulated, and there's already kind of like this lack of trust. I think it's easier to try to trust something outside of that when, you don't trust that institution anymore, or something happened within that institution, right? It's like, oh, well, I'm not going to believe in you anymore. I'm going to go to this other thing because I want to be able to find purpose elsewhere.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point too. And I would, every time I'm hesitant to talk about conspiracy theory because I tend to be skeptical, and yet I always feel like I'm missing another important reason for understanding why it's there and even respecting it to some degree. And that's another great one, is that the institutions that we should be trusting or supposed to be trusting have definitely shown us over and over again that they don't deserve it, that they've hurt people, like whatever, African Americans who've been used for, like the Tuskegee stuff. Like that's just insane, right? Or, mainstream media, New York Times coming out, or, whatever, coming out pro-war stances. Basically, no, you guys just hosed us on that one. Now, it doesn't mean that all the reporters are all part of some cabal, but it does mean that we have reasons to distrust every one of these institutions historically. And that's where, for me, like the leaky boat thing, I tend to be more of a centrist, because I see human institutions as sometimes very oppressive, but also kind of another leaky boat, especially science and technology. And so it's sort of both. And so I tend to be a little bit, cut it more slack. But somebody who's more radical might just see my position as a kind of sellout or a kind of weak centrism, as opposed to a kind of radical renewal. Like we must reject all of these institutions. We must reject all the bankers and all the Wall Street and all the mainstream media. They're all part of the same con, and turn to something else. That's just probably not my temperament. I don't think it's helpful politically at this time. But then I'm also, my father's a scientist. So I can't, it's like part of my inheritance. And in some sense, it's part of my privilege. I come from a well-educated background. And so I've already drank the Kool-Aid of that world, even if I'm critical of a lot of aspects of it. So it's still part of my world in a way that other people, they never got any rewards from it. And so they're probably more reasonable to say, why bother with this? This other story seems to make sense to me. We could talk about all this in terms of psychedelics too, because the rise of, psychedelic conspiracy theory, and that like the whole thing was just a way to prevent revolution from happening. And Huxley was in on it, and Watson was in on it, and McKenna's in on it. And McKenna's a CIA agent. And you're like, okay, but it's all happening inside that too. And the final thing to say about conspiracy theories, and it's kind of like my attitude about a lot of religion as well, and there's interesting connections between the two, is that, again, I try to take them seriously without taking them literally, meaning that I think that they are often allegories or dream texts that a little analysis can unveil something that's really important to recognize. Whereas mainstream people, they just don't want to think about it. Or the people who are into it, that's all they think about. Whereas like the 5G thing for me is like, no, I don't believe that the 5G corona, I think it seems very unlikely. And nobody I know who I respect gives it the slightest bit of energy. That said, to have a conspiracy theory about 5G in general is a great allegory for what I see as another example of the technological economic elites making an undemocratic decision and forcing it down our throats in the absence of the amount of testing and understanding about the electromagnetic nature of human biology that it deserves for the degree of intensity. And they're doing it not just to like have better signal, but to install this order of interneted physical objects that I think will lead to many very dystopian circumstances. So I'm pretty critical of 5G. So when I see that conspiracy theory, I see a kind of popular folklore allegory for a real problem that's difficult to think about in its own terms because it's complicated and it involves a lot of different actors, different things that you know about, that you don't know about, that they don't know about. It's hard to wrap it up. So if you just get a good story, you're actually pointing to something real, but it's in this kind of distorted lens. And I think a lot of conspiracy theory works that way.
Yeah, there's a quote that keeps coming to my mind by Alfred North Whitehead. There's no whole truths. All truths are half truths, right? Like maybe there are some things that are true within some of these conspiracies. Maybe there's some truth here. Maybe there's some truth there. And it's really hard to kind of like navigate it at times and try to figure out, well what do I believe or what could be true?
Yeah, it's true. And then that's also about, it becomes like in a weird way, a kind of existential choice about where do you put your identity, or where do you put your conviction, or it's like, again, it's like the way that you're kind of handing over. It seems like you're gaining autonomy by knowing the secret truth, but you're actually kind of handing your authority over to a kind of hysteria, over the topness that actually disallows you from continuing to be a questioning, thinking subject, because now you have your answer, or you're part of a community that has this answer, and then that becomes a source of identity. And so in a way, like there's no perfect answer about where to put your identity, or like how in your field, how much do you identify with therapeutic language, with the language of processing, of the psychological language of what's happening, whether it's specific clinical categories or whether it's a sort of general ambiance of wellness that is infused with this kind of therapy talk. And like, obviously, a lot of that is really good for people. It's also a existing world that has its own practitioners and tons of subjects, and it's how money gets distributed, how health happens in our society. So it needs to be respected for that. But how much do you bring it in when you see its limitations? And so we're always kind of negotiating between different kind of language worlds that we have some emphasis or some identification with, or some energy, but only so much. And when we get over identified or over swallowed up in it, we kind of lose autonomy, and we lose ability to see multiple perspectives. And so we kind of do that a little bit all the time. And I think it's good to have a dose of conspiracy theory, of that kind of skepticism. And I recognize that for that worlds to happen, there have to be people who are professionals, who are devoted to it. And so I even sort of kind of tolerate it to a degree in that way. But I think we've come to a very unbalanced place because of how people consume media and how poor a lot of people are at critical thinking, and other kind of things we could say along those lines.
So shifting gears a little bit to
Sure.
anomalies and synchronicities, and perhaps people fudging with those. Like the Discordian's really famous for it, and you covered that pretty well. Given the space allowed, that could involve many volumes, I'm sure. But something that came up for me as I was reading your book, I totally forgot that one of the characters in the Illuminatus trilogy was Saul Goodman, and this thing that kind of rhymes with Discordianism for me is like this modern incarnation of Saul Goodman in the Breaking Bad mythos, Better Call Saul, for instance. And he's this kind of Discordian con artist guy who's like a really interesting character. And it kind of struck me like, is this coincidence? Was this done on purpose? Like perhaps it was, but it's this like, where do we peg this thing?
Yeah.
And perhaps like, as you were writing the book, did anything come up for you that was weird? Like, were you getting transmissions from Mescalito or, aliens from the star system Sirius?
Well, one of the things is just, there are what people call research synchronicities.
Yeah.
And if you look at Robert Anton Wilson's Cosmic Trigger, which is his most explicit book about his own experience of being overwhelmed with synchronicity, as well as other paranormal events and lots of drug trips and stuff, you realize actually when you read it closely that a lot of the synchronicities are actually just books talking to each other in weird and unexpected and anomalous ways. But the way that texts start to resonate, and you mentioned earlier about like why do people do psychedelics tend to buy into conspiracy theories. Well, I think you're right that you mentioned like, association is that we like reason is a way of modulating our pattern recognition. So we are pattern recognition machines. If we don't pattern recognize at all, we're kind of idiots, almost in a technical sense. Like we have to be able to like start to recognize patterns in order to do science, even to do very hardcore, real deal science and whatever. We need to be able to recognize patterns. And then in our own lives, patterns of behavior, anticipating, But if you just do more and more and more and more of that, then it all starts fitting together. Everything starts cueing everything else. And you get these sort of mass synchronicities. And, one of those a day is kind of a trip, but, one every 10 minutes is crazy. That's psychosis. So, and I say that not to go, oh, that's all psychotic. It's the opposite, is that we are on a spectrum of pattern recognition. And if we are underdo it, we are cold. We don't understand other people's emotions. There are aspects of that you see in some autistic behaviors, although in other ways, autistics are incredible at cognitively making connections, or some of them are. But, and then there's sort of a middle zone, and then you get more and more. And that they've even done studies that people who have sort of hyper pattern recognition are more likely to believe New Age ideas or occult ideas or paranormal ideas. So we're kind of on this sort of thing where we're kind of modulating and playing with it. And that for writers and intellectuals, if you talk to them, even when they're not dealing with weird stuff, they're just writing about whatever, a lot of people have stories about the book just fell from the shelf and they're open to the page. And I've had tons of those, not just with this project, like very clear, the book just falls in your hands. Somebody mentions it at just the right time. You open it to any page and there's the passage that you wanted. The first time I gave a lecture on Philip K. Dick, it was called Philip K. Dick's Postmodern Gnosis. And it was based on my thesis at Yale. So it was like 1989. I was young and I got all my notes, already. I was going to, here we go and give my talk. And then I realized, like literally just before the talk began, that I didn't have a good definition of gnosis, and what Gnosticism was. I was just using it, but not really. I was like, oh God, I got to get it. So I picked up, I had a paperback copy of Ballasts, and I went, oh shit, there's something in here. And I just right there. Gnosis is the belief that the lower ignorant God is the one who disguises the true God who lies beyond, and it was just like, bam, and I've had like that kind of stuff a lot. And I've had weirder ones too, or things that are more paranormal or visionary, that kind of involve the same sort of material, the same kind of science fiction, satellites, this kind of post-religious California techno visionary stuff. And that's partly why my work is what it is, because I've had my own glimpses of those things. But I think in some ways the more mundane but also more pervasive research synchronicities are just as much a part of its tale.
How do you make sense of that? Or how do you make sense of that?
Well, I'll take them when I get them. I'll run with it. If I get a,
yeah.
I have, in some ways, I have a really aesthetic view of these realms. Meaning that I don't mean like artsy. I mean that I enjoy the feelings, associations associated with them. But in the same way that we do not believe great works of art, I don't leave with some sense that I have now seen something that requires me to revise my worldview. So what do I mean by that? So I've had a visionary experience with a Orthodox icon in a cathedral in Southwest England. I've talked about this before. I don't talk about a lot of my experiences because I prefer to keep them inside, but I'm just sitting there walking through a beautiful cathedral in Exeter, and just that whole space and feeling. And then there was this Orthodox icon, this Eastern Orthodox image of Mary. And I looked at it and it just went the blue mantle, and you see Mary's head, and then there's this blue mantle, and then the outer robe, and the blue mantle that was sort of around her face became deep space, like the star field, and it was just and so as that happens, I'm like, soak it up, eat it up, take it, blessing coming in, okay, it's going, all right, it's going, woo, wow, that was cool, all right, great, all right, that's just part of the flow, and now we go on and get I'm hungry, so I'm gonna, and it's not like dismissive, and I'm sure, and I've had experiences that do force a change where I can't go back, but a lot of time I think that these experiences are the most we can really say about a lot of these experiences, not all of them. The most we can really say is that they happen. That's it. They happen. and then a lot of people, they want to make it, okay, well, this means that time is like this and and they love speculation. They come like, well, it can't just be this. It has to be these other things because this shows that, and all that whole production. Personally, I'm less, I used to be interested in it more. I'm less interested in it now because I'm more and more comfortable that we are in an immense mystery that has features that we can recognize and rationalize about, but that the take home prize is mystery. And so I don't feel the goad to try to figure it out or to change my metaphysics. Instead, I just am incredibly appreciative of those events. And I recognize that if they start happening every 10 minutes, it's time for a benzo and a check-in. I mean, it's like, that's not the route, I mean, you might have no choice in the matter, but it's not what you want.
No. It reminds me of two McKenna or a Groff line and a McKenna line. Groff, once in a while, when he was encountered by somebody telling him a 30-minute story about their trip, he'll say, many strange things happen under the influence of LSD. And then and McKenna's line of like, well, reality is weirder than we can suppose. Something along those lines. And it's like, well, like traditions, there's many religious traditions that can help you if that's what you want, is like a firm religious background and like things and a solid ground of sorts. You can go there, but perhaps that you're not being totally intellectually honest with yourself if you just buy it wholeheartedly.
Yeah, and I think that's what part of what psychedelics is as a teacher, as a if you approach it as a pedagogical environment, it's a learning environment. And I think that's the best way. That part of what you're learning may be to heal, and part of what you're learning is to heal, energetically, biologically, psychologically, whatever. But if you look at it as like an environment of learning, then if you just believe, you're like, that's not learning. Learning is how to be a critical thinker, how to move forward, and it's the same thing. So in some ways, I think the ideas of bringing in religion and whether it's, esoteric Buddhism or Christian mysticism or indigenous, shamanic pathways, like bringing that stuff in is obviously part of the learning experience because it gives you a go to actually learn about those things. And if you learn about them intelligently and anthropologically, as well as like the ideas, that's helpful. But I think in other ways, the teaching, the lessons, the university of psychedelics is different than religion. It's separate almost. And it's its own thing. That's what you're learning from the experiences that then, feed back into the next time and And when I read accounts of real transformation that is spiritual and intellectual or philosophical as well as personal and emotional, they almost always are approaching it in that kind of light of thinking about them as teachers. And it's a great model because it works both for the secular and for the religious or supernatural thinker. Because if those stories work for you, then the teacher, it's an ally. It's a plant spirit. And you are engaging a dialogue with this plant spirit that in some ways knows more than you, and then in other ways is not human. So you can only connect so far. And so you're building a kind of relationship, and then the bad things that happen are teaching or lessons, and the good things are insights, and you keep building that up. But you can also be a very skeptical person who thinks that these are just collections of molecules that are interacting with historical body minds and producing effects. But if you're going to keep doing it, why not just approach that as a learning experience? Well, how do these things work? What happens when I do this? What happens when I do it when I'm tired? What happens when I pre-program my experience by going, hey, how about this time I meet my spirit animal? Like, I don't believe it, but I'm just going to go, this time I'm going to meet my spirit animal. And then lo and behold, you have an encounter that stays with you, that never really leaves. Well, that's pretty cool too. And so the teaching model seems to cover a lot more. And, part of my whole goal here is like, the healing stuff is great. Medicina, whether it's spiritual or psychotherapeutic, we need it, but it ain't the whole story. And it should never be the whole story. And people should be knowing when they're going into this, especially newbies who are going into this because they have specific psychological issues and they're working with someone who's just treating that psychological issue. Somewhere early along the way, you should get a little, just want to remind you that you may be initiating a profound, philosophical, existential adventure that never really ends. So just wanted to add that.
That was fun. Speaking of psychological issues, somebody that was mentioned here and there in the book was Aleister Crowley, kind of being like a pioneering skeptical psychonaut of sorts that kind of laid the groundwork for a lot of what we're dealing with today. I don't know, how do you pitch that? Like we're in this kind of weird zone where Aleister Crowley's still a really bad man that many people don't want to check out. But it's like, how do you say like, hey, there is some value here, but what do you do with that? Part one of my worlds is the world of esoteric scholars. Like that was the zone that I got my PhD in. I still like to go to those conferences. It's about the only academic world that I really love and identify with. And so like in that world, it's just a given that this guy was like brilliant, cracked, arrogant, absurd, cruel, visionary, whatever. It's all there, and then some people are like true believers, even though they're academics. So in that world, there's a lot of respect, and probably even more than he needs. It's like Crowley lives large in that kind of modern esoteric history. And then inside the kind of Robert Anton Wilson world or the weird psychedelic underculture, he's always had a certain kind of, bad boy rep that people are positive about. Once you move outside of that, like, I can't say if it's really worthwhile for anybody else to go into that particular Hall of Mirrors, because he is such a rough character, and he was misogynist and cruel and kind of full of shit and a creepy guru, and he set up some really screwed up scenes, and undoubtedly people who got caught up in his scenes got screwed over. But it's also kind of goes with the territory, and that gets into this tricky thing where, like, I've said all that negative stuff about cult leaders before. And I have to, if I'm really honest with myself, I kind of go, yeah, but if they're really brilliant and they kind of do something new and it's like, it's got critical force over time, I'm kind of like, you get a little bit of a pass, So for me, like, Osho kind of gets a pass. Like, and people, wild country, and they were poisoning people. I go, oh yeah, it totally got out of hand. No. Actual unethical things happen. Maybe even evil things happen. But like, it would just be a lie to go to, the world would have been better without Osho. And I feel the same way about Crowley. I just can't. It would be unethical for me to write him off because of what I understand both as his role and just personally what
my own encounters with Crowley and synchronicities around him and dreams around him and practicing in ritual forms that are influenced by him. It would just be rude to be, but I don't push it, because then if some people are like, look, this is about feminists now, this stuff is just so heinous.
Right.
I'm like, you got it. Although the one thing about Crowley that is not said enough is that while he wrote a lot and too much, and sometimes atrociously, when he was on, almost more than anything else, just like McKenna and Dick and Wilson, is he was a great writer, like a powerful, wild, inventive, juicy. I mean, you have to have a certain taste for the over the top, but vision in the voice. Come on, man. That's like visionary. It's great visionary literature. So, I also just respect anybody who's like a good writer, even if they're also kind of screwed up. Like you just kind of get a pass. So that's sort of my attitude about Crowley. Like, I don't push it. I totally get it if people don't like him, but it would just be, he's just, he's still Uncle Al to me, and it's just, it's too late.
Genesis Peorage years ago said this thing. I forget where the recently late great Genesis Peorage said something along the lines of like how cults are actually really important in the development of humanity. And, we see that with, Christianity, the rites of Eleusis, et cetera. And people should theoretically be doing these experiments in groups of, 30 to 100. And, even if it's really risky, it's probably worth it for the collective human history for you to go do these wild things.
Yeah, I mean, I come back to a metaphor that I used at the beginning of our conversation, which is theater. So what's a cult?
Right.
It's a kind of director or creative director who sets a stage where usually they are the one who knows, or the mystic man or whatever. And then there's a theater of clothes and rituals and all this material and images and language and all these scripts that people learn, and you come in and then you're like, what's going on here? And it goes, oh no, you must bow down and say this. You're like, okay. And then you learn that script. And so you get more people reproducing the script. And then what's the point of the thing? It's an open-ended theater piece that at its heart, or is often very experimental. We don't know where we're going. What is this thing about? Is this going to be fun? And some people get burned. Some people get really burned. A lot of people, in the end, they are kind of have mixed feelings about it. Some people have a great time. I remember, I'll never forget, I met there's this poet who used to live in New York City called Sparrow, lived in the Lower East Side, classic character, kind of a beatnik style guy, but younger, but that kind of poet, counterculture dude. And I met him at a party, and he said, I remember how the 70s came up, and he goes, oh, my wife and I spent the 70s in cults. And you ask him about it. He goes, oh yeah. She was in a sex cult, and I was in this kind of Hindu cult. It was a lot of fun, and then you're like, oh yeah, there's this whole other story of the people who don't get screwed, who it's just experiences. They went through a theater. They had a love affair. They fell in love with a crazy person, or whatever. And you're like, yeah, it's dangerous. So I mean, in a lot of ways, I agree with Genesis on that. And a lot of good stuff comes out of it. A lot of creative stuff comes out of it. And it's also just in a lot of ways, a stronger form of things that happen anyway, either in conventional religion or therapy or political parties or subcultures, musical subcultures. And they do have more of this thing about authority and like the father figure or the mother figure, and that gets kinkier and more easily screwed up. But some of the screw up comes from the outside being so threatened by the fact that these people, like with psychedelics, part of what's threatening about them is that you're questioning some of the fundamental presuppositions of the society around you. And that's really deeply threatening, including the family. So cults break off people from their families, and their families are understandably totally freaked out. If my sister got absorbed in one of those things, I'd be totally pissed off going after these people. But it's also because it's actually undermining that to create some space for something else to happen. And while some of those things have been nasty, a lot of them have been benign, or at least just weird, or more fun than working at a bank. Like working at a bank, sex cults, what am I to say? So it's a little bit of a controversial perspective, and I try not to be flip about it because I get it. I've studied religious history and especially modern cult stuff, and but again, if you take someone like Osho, I'm just like, or Gurdjieff, I'm like, the trickster guys, or Trungpa, yes, there were sexual excesses, and from a position where that's the most important thing, is this some kind of procedure that maintains sexual decorum and it doesn't get involved in these power plays. But my understanding of it, when I actually look at the history, it's just more complicated than that. It's not just like an evil guru stooping everybody. Sometimes that happens, but even there, it's complicated. It's really hard. And I get it that some people are just have no patience with what I'm saying and would even, attack me for taking that position, which they would see as cavalier. And, I get it, but I'm just of a generation and an attitude, a personal temperament, as well as a generation that just is not as risk averse in that way. And I'm a point of privilege and I'm male, and so I get it. But at the same time, to not acknowledge that is how I see things would be untrue. And so hopefully it's helpful to say it, but I recognize that it's a problematic stance.
And people can go home and ask themselves if Millbrook was worth it. I think yes, but there's really fucked up stuff happening there too. But this is just the history that we've been dealt, and now we can go forward and create our own personal weird histories in the future. Hopefully, if we don't get knocked out.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Cool. So we've been going for a while. I feel like we could go for about 8 hours, but let's wrap here.
Sounds great.
Yeah, cool. So anything you want to let everybody know about your book or your website or anything you're up to?
I've just started a mailing list on Substack, and I'm going to kind of experiment with that as a place to write. I haven't been writing that much the last year, and so I'm hoping that'll kick in there. But I still filter everything through my website, TechGnosis.com. I just posted a scholarly article I wrote on Gnostic psychedelia that I think is actually kind of interesting. It touches on some of the stuff we're talking about, but particularly the politics of psychedelic conspiracy, really, and the idea of dark manipulative forces and how that is an important feature of modern psychedelia. So that's on my website that I just put up a couple days ago. And so I'm doing that. And then the Psychedelic Saga is now virtual because of the events. So I'm doing that every month and plotting other Psychedelic Saga rollouts that'll probably be coming out later this summer. So.
And High Weirdness on Audible.
Oh, and then the audiobook, of course. High Weirdness and Audible. And I have to say, I did it. I read it. And I enjoyed it. And I think I did a pretty good job. And I worked really hard to try to make some of the dense stuff in the book entertaining by just using the voice in an entertaining way, and also helping to communicate a little bit more. So I think it's actually a much better way of encountering it for a lot of people than actually reading it, unless you're someone who really likes reading dense books with lots of footnotes. It's probably more fun just to listen to me and my hilarious Terence McKenna.
I loved it.
Imitation.
I loved it.
Yeah, I love that.
I can tell you're kind of like trying not to go too far with it, but like
exactly because I could go far with it, and I started to go too far, and the engineer was like, "No, dude, that's too much." So we had to like kind of put like a nice a mix,
I loved it.
Fun.
All right. Well, thank you, Erik Davis. I really appreciate you joining us today, and hope we can do it again.
Yeah, it was wonderful. You guys, good luck with everything.
All right, welcome back. I hope you enjoyed that episode with Erik Davis. I know Joe and I had a wonderful time chatting with him, and just really grateful for Erik's time for joining us here on the show to chat about his work. Again, definitely check out his book, High Weirdness. If you like audio, you can grab an audio book. It's up on Audible. And if you aren't on Audible, you can get a 30-day trial, free trial, 30 days. If you go to psychedelicstoday.com/welcome, there's an image for Audible there. Or if you go to audibletrial.com/psychedelics today. and you could do it that way as well. Yeah. Hope you enjoyed it. And again, if you have any questions, comments, feedback, anything like that, love to hear from you. We love hearing from folks. Psychedelics Today, email@gmail.com. That's our email. You can hit us up there. And if you like what we're doing here, be sure to subscribe to us wherever you listen to podcasts, iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, and leave a review. If you're on iTunes or Facebook, hop on over there and leave us a review. That helps us out tremendously. And if you want to support the show any other way, patreon.com/psychedelics today, or just share anything, share a piece of content. That helps us out as well. And probably the best way to help promote what we're doing over here is just sharing content, spreading the awareness, and getting it out there to the world. So Kyle signing off here. Thanks for joining, and we will catch you on the next episode of Psychedelics Today. Have a wonderful week. Stay safe, stay healthy. Take care.